I want to talk a little bit about this idea of self knowledge and the authentic self. I'll tell you what inspired me to do this. I have an anecdote from last week. I was invited to give a talk at a singles event that was mostly populated by women 45 to about 65 and troubles they had in relationships and dating and so forth. And since I talk a lot about personal relationships, I was asked to speak. But before I spoke, the organizers put on several skits, rather tragic skits of dates gone wrong. And as I watched the skits, I got an insight into a world I really hadn't thought about. And there was one in particular that struck me. And within about a minute, I reshaped my entire talk on the fly. And let me tell you what the skit was and what happened to me and the things I said to this group of people. The skit was a woman on a date with a man. And at the very end of the date, the man says, can we split the check? And now remember, this is an amateurish little skit. It's not to be taken seriously. And the woman is offended and she says, you drive a Porsche and I know you're a very wealthy man. I know a lot about you. You know that I'm a person of very modest means. Why would you want to split the check? I find that offensive. And she stood up in a huff and marched off the stage, and gathered women broke out into applause that this was some kind of great rebuke of this person for being such a cheapskate. Okay, it was funny. It was okay. And then as I thought about the other skits that I saw, I asked myself, why does dating go wrong? Why do relationships go wrong? Why do our lives fall apart? Why do we feel that we become fragmented, that we become torn apart, hit by sometimes insufferable grief? Moments in love can be profoundly redemptive, but all love goes through the crucible. Certainly long-lasting love goes through the crucible of ongoing relationships. And as I thought about this, I said to the group, the first thing I said is, what is the key to a successful date? What is the key to a successful relationship? Before we get to issues of compassion and boundary setting, I said the first thing is self-knowledge. And I didn't go into it to the degree that I want to tonight and tomorrow, but when one goes on the path towards self-knowledge, there's one essential thing I think we have to know, that you won't discover it until you decide that's what you're discovering. I'll say this another way. The authentic self is not something that you find, something that you discover. The authentic self is that which is continuously in the process of self-knowledge. Meaning the authentic self is not fixed. It's developed over a lifetime in the path towards self-knowledge, and then self-knowledge as it spreads down into your consciousness, into your personality and so forth, and links up to other people. Of course, in addition to self-knowledge, we have to realize that the other person has a profound and deep inner life, even if they're not sure how to talk about it. So the extension of self-knowledge is empathy and inferential knowledge to the inner lives of other people, and to round this out, as I normally do, what's happening in the given moment. So what's happening in myself, what's happening in another person, and what's happening in the process of things. So that has to be rather stable. So here's the thing that you have to know. In my mind, what we need to know is that we all have a sacred center. If you don't believe you have a sacred center, I don't think you'll ever truly arrive at what I would call self-knowledge. Now, you don't have to use religious or spiritual terminology. I'm not exactly sure how to translate this into atheistic language, but it's something that you are a channel of some kind of divinity, and the divinity is your starting place of your self-knowledge. And I think if we can sink into our sacred center, that we somehow channel the divine and be able to sit there and know that place deeply, we can be producers of great poetry. We can be producers of incredible thoughts, wonderful ways that we communicate with other people out of a heart of truth. So as I discussed some of these things, I offered to the crowd a little rewriting of the script. And here's the way I rewrote the script. The man says, can we go half? Can we split the tab? And I offered that the woman in the skit who got offended, that she took a very deep moment and she found her sacred center, which means she went past being offended. She went past being hurt, being judgmental, being treated unfairly. She went past all of that. And she, as it were, tracked her being down so that that moment was not the most important thing in her life. What was the most important thing in her life was her sacred center. And then whenever we get taken off our sacred center, and we see this so much today, people filled with hatred, people filled with bias and animosity, and impervious to listening to other people. You can't even have a conversation. A person who cannot have a conversation is, in my mind, a person profoundly lacking in self-knowledge, a person profoundly lacking in a sense of the sacred within. Because if you find the sacred within, then you know there's a sacred in the other person. There's a sacred in the other person, and they think differently from you. You start with the fact that there are two sacred beings encountering each other. It's not a time for judgmentalism and anger and taking offense, unless something, of course, is truly overtly offensive. I'll talk about them in just a moment. I had one of those moments at this talk. And I asked her to think for a moment, why would this man, at least from the skit's perspective, of considerable wealth, say, let's split the tab? I just put out to the group. So one person raised their hand and says, because he's a cheapskate. I said, okay, that's one possible answer. I said, what else? Another person said, well, it seems this man might feel that he's constantly being taken advantage of and only seen as an object of wealth and well-being. And so for him, it was, in the skit, a rather inelegant way to say something that probably could not be said at a first date. Something like this. I've been on a lot of dates. People know I have money, and sometimes I'm afraid that people aren't being authentic with me because behind everything is the fact that I have money. Now, having money is a great thing, but it can really get in the way of people. So I didn't have his full speech, but I gave the so-called actress a little speech where she says, for you to ask us to split the tab tells me you've been hurt. You've been objectified. You feel taken advantage of. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pay for the whole thing. I just want to tell you that I'm grateful that we had this time together. And if you want to go out again, we can talk about who's going to pay before we get together again. But I want to tell you, I can see you're hurt. And the room got very quiet. So then I went on with the talk that I'll describe to you. And the woman who played the part came to me afterwards and she said, look, your lines would not have been funny. It was a sketch to create a familiar environment. And she said to me, but I truly wish I had known that version before I went out there. She said, I would have done the skit, but I would know that I'm playing the part of an offended person, that I'm playing the part of a person without self-knowledge, without the ability to understand the inner life of another person. She said, in our own language, she said, what you said is so graceful and so beautiful. And she says, I just really want to thank you. I said, look, you played the part well, you got great laughs. But she came to me after my talk. I said, but I'm very serious about this. That, as I recommended to the people there, before you go to the first date, you have to find your sacred center. And I'm saying for this, before you go to the date on the calendar. before you meet up with, as Heidegger would say, time and being, your being put in time. And the only thing that you control fully, I think, is your own consciousness. That you can control. We can't control a lot about the date in the calendar that we're going to encounter. But we can shape our consciousness. And that's why I think it's very important early in the day to, I describe what I call the second daily practice. The first daily practice is the virtue practice, which I've talked about incessantly, and I always will, because I think it's a savor of relationships. But the second daily practice, as most of you know, and by the way, I'm teaching a class on this starting Wednesday night, is retreating back from the noise in the unconscious ego self. There's anger, resentment. I'm talking about the negative ego states. Depression, anxiety, guilt, shame. They take up a lot of room. In fact, you don't even know that they're there until you disidentify and stand back and watch them. So I call this the observer mind. I can see them. The objective mind, I can look at them and ask, are they tied to reality? Or are they mostly of my making? And sometimes our anger, hurt, depression, fear, guilt, shame, anxiety, they are connected to a real world. It's very sad. But the fact that they're, as it were, appropriate responses to triggers in the real world doesn't mean that at some higher level or deeper level, we don't have a choice in the matter. Because then you can say, all right, there are things out in the world that really hurt me. There are things in the world that anger me, that I resent. There are things about myself where I feel guilt and shame. I have anxiety about things. All that is true. But that's not my sacred center. So you rise above this. And I talk about going to the rational mind where you really try to figure out your life. That's an important step. And then the truth mind where you hit just the truth of the human condition, that you are one instance of the human condition, which in spite of moments of sublimity and beauty and grace and love, there's going to be pain and tragedy. That's just written into the human condition. So we are always in some version of living in that interplay between beauty and tragedy. And then I talk about going even higher than that into the realms of love, justice, truth, and beauty. But love, justice, and truth and beauty are not just ideals. They are also ways of knowing the world. So if you really believe in the power of love, that transformative power to be loving and to accept the love of another person, even when you're going through a tough moment with another person and you say to yourself, as a channel of love, resentment and anger have no place here. As a object of self-love, it's only from self-love that we can, in my mind, that we can do teshuvah. And therefore, guilt and shame have no place there. From a religious perspective, this is what love of God is. It's a very hard thing to talk about unless a person has actually experienced this. That when you discover your sacred center, you have a profound love for the source of the sacred. I mean, I know that sometimes when I've said, Baruch Atah Adonai, which is cause of being, you are the source of blessing, and I just meditate that, sometimes I just start to cry. That I'm encountering Atah, you, the cause of being, are the source of blessing. And when I just sit inside of that, I can feel, by the way, lots of training and lots of work. This is not easy. I've described it as water dripping through a concrete block. And after enough drips into the concrete block, finally a channel is formed and the waters gush up. So many people who say, I don't feel the sacred waters rushing in. I don't feel that deep connection that you're talking about. And I sometimes say, how long have you been dripping water on the granite? I mean, for some people, this just comes effortlessly. It didn't come that way for me. I had a few moments of extraordinary gifts of grace, but in order to regularize it, I had to, suffer moments of deep, of deep pain and feeling kind of an alienation from the good. But when you arrive at the place where you have knowledge of your own sacred center, that you know that you are a channel of love for other human beings, and that despite feelings of shame and guilt, that you see yourself as an object of love at your depth, which means because you are worthy of love and being loved, you can do teshuvah. Whatever's happened in your life, that's not, from this perspective, that's not your essential core. That's not who you are. Now, sometimes when we do things that we feel guilty about and ashamed of, is because we were not in our sacred core. If one sees oneself ultimately, deeply, as living in a moral covenant with the divine and other people, yes, as we see with the people of Israel, sometimes triggers are so great, external and internal, that we do things that we later profoundly regret. But as I spoke about the high holidays, look what a profound thing regret and remorse are. There are such holy moments because you realize, I could have been other. I could have been other. I could have been a channel of love. I won't talk about the other ways of knowing the world at length tonight. I'll talk about them tomorrow. That justice is a way of seeing the world. Beauty is a way of seeing the world. Truth is a way of seeing the world. So when you look for self-knowledge, one thing you're asking, what is the knowledge by which I see the world? Now, this knowledge cannot be articulated in a simple sentence. Again, it's a knowledge that comes together over, I think, years and years of spiritual work. So, I didn't get into the depths that I'm speaking now, but instead of talking about how to be less defensive, how to set better boundaries, which is some of what I was called to talk about, I wanted to talk about what it would mean to be in your sacred center and to breathe in that spot and observe the moment and ask yourself, am I doing anything to drive out the possibility of sacred here? Even if you know there's not going to be a next date. There's a human being with a soul across the table. Now, one thing I did say is the other person might not be up to it, which means if you can find your way to your sacred center and you can know the world, and you know that love, justice, truth, and beauty, the good, etc., are ways of knowing the world, and you want to know the world that way, and you want to be with people who know the world that way, you discover not everybody's up to it. So you do whatever you can. Maybe you can, through metaphor and poetry, bring a person to this way of knowing. So what gets in the way of this sacred knowing? This is my talk for tomorrow, what we call the inner Pharaoh that I mentioned in my Devar Torah tonight. What I recommended, if you see my Shabbat thought, is that the image of the cruel Pharaoh on the throne that oppresses us within, yes, that's a valid metaphor for the inner Pharaoh. But I suggested in my Shabbat thought that that's just a cardboard figure that hides the howling wasteland of the journey to self-knowledge. And try to imagine you're trying to exit your prison cell. And you look at Pharaoh and say, whoa, you're enslaving me. Look at my Yetzer Hara. Look at all the terrible things that I do. And then the cardboard figure pulls aside. And you look at the howling wasteland of the path to self-knowledge. Now, some people will say, I can't traverse that. That door slams, you go back to your prison cell. I'm not saying it's not a good thing to talk about the inner Pharaoh as the Yetzer Hara. That's a very good thing to talk about. But that's what I call, if you don't mind my saying, that's medium knowledge. You have to go to a much deeper place even to understand the Yetzer Hara, to fight the Yetzer Hara and realize that it is not part of your essential self. It's not a way of knowing your essence and knowing your sacred center. So to sum up for tonight, when I think about what it means to be present here to other people, what it means to be present to ourselves, present to the divine, takes enormous contemplative, meditative work. But once you break through one day and you know there's that sacred fire within, you can never go back. Now, the next day when you get up, you might say, I want to find it again, but you can't find it. You're stuck in the howling wasteland, and then you got to get on with your life. You don't say it's not there. You don't say there's something on the other side of the howling wasteland. You say, I didn't make it today. But one thing I will not do, this is, I think, an act of will, a decision. One thing I will not do is diminish the sacred in the world. I will not diminish the sacred in the world. Within myself, I will transcend those ugly moments and the negative ego states. I won't create ugliness in relationships. I won't have even ugly thoughts that you've decided to do. Now, of course, they plague us, but we have knowledge and will to fight that. So tomorrow I want to go into a little more precision, a little more depth on this path that I'm sharing with you tonight. But I thought about my first words to this group about how to have a successful relationship. And I said, the first thing in a successful relationship, successful anything, if you want a life of depth and meaning, is self-knowledge in the way that I've described it.